Okay, thank you all for joining us. So I want to go through and say a little bit about what I found really insightful about the papers, and then open it up for Q&A. And as I open it up, I'll allow them to respond to what I've said, and also allow the audience to sort of chime in. So as Kevin was talking, I was reminded of a conversation I had with some colleagues a few days ago that work with me as part of the prison education program at NYU. And one of the other professors had apparently complained about a student, and we teach at Wallkill Correctional Facility. One of the students in his class on criminalization was spending a lot of time talking about armed resistance and how he thought armed resistance and like black people having guns was the only way to be liberated. And not only was the professor concerned, but he even complained to the program, and he was saying, I just want him to read more and delve more deeply into the history of civil rights and things like that. And I was sort of like intrigued by the idea that this professor was so concerned about this student's resolute position, and it made me wonder if the professor would have complained if, for instance, the student had said peace is the only way, right? In the same way that he was saying arms is the only way, would he have been as concerned if the student said peace is the only way? So I want us to think about that. I'll now come back to some of those themes in my comments. But I'll begin with Kessie Alexandre's paper, which I thought was really creative as a way to open a conversation about uneven geographies, as she puts it, building upon David Harvey and others, and about the violence and sort of environmental racism that defines life for black and brown people who are structured as placeless. So she uses placelessness as a kind of concept. And in particular, Kessie's interested in infrastructure failure and water. And it reminded me of something I saw the other day on ESPN about this coach, Tom Herman, a really celebrated college football coach. And he has this thing where he posted this hydration chart in his locker room. And the chart had like all the way from like clear, if your urine is clear, all the way to brown. And the darker colored urines is like you're gonna go to rehab, you'll sit out games, this and that. But the clear level of urine, he had put championship level hydration, right? And he literally went on to explain how he saw being really hydrated as essential to success in college football. He went so far as to say, we haven't had any concussions this year, and it's because they've been drinking a lot of water. And he said, when you're very hydrated, your brain sits more comfortably in your head. It's less likely to rattle around as much. He's like, if you take a piece of meat that's like moist in a package, it's flexible, it's durable. He's like, a piece of beef jerky, you can just bite it and rip it. So he's like, sort of imagine the meat in your body as meat that's either well hydrated or not, right? But I found this fascinating because in Flint, Michigan, as we know, in Newark, and other places, the water's not even safe to drink, right? So how could you ever achieve championship level hydration if you can't even drink the water that comes out of your faucet? So this just shows how kind of stark it is. One of the most brilliant and intriguing moments in Kessie's papers is her reading of Newark residents recovering fish in times of flood. And obviously it's an image with biblical implications, a flood that creates new possibilities, a miracle that delivers sustenance. It's also an image that Kessie shows us reveals aspects of the broader commentary on Newark residents, that they are desperate and needy and ignorant. And she uses this fast-out debate and turns it into a thoughtful argument about self-provisioning, about ingenuity. And I like the idea of self-provisioning because it sort of captures the ingenuity in what people are doing. It's a better concept than like resilience, how some other people would characterize it, because like resilience, only marginal people are described as resilient, right? The same way that only marginal people are described as having agency or needing agency. So I thought self-provisioning is more focused on, as she put it, black geographic knowledge. And so I want to come back to that because I'm wondering if Kessie would accept a concept like expertise. Is black geographic knowledge expertise or is it not? Is it important to you to differentiate that? So for Brandon Hunter, he uses the killing of unarmed African Americans by police or by self-appointed neighborhood watchmen as a window into what he calls the ominous potential for racial gun violence that plagues African Americans. Brandon asks that we shift our focus from the perpetrator and the motivation of an individual perpetrator to the objects that define that predicament, in this case, the gun. And one of the most insightful and the most important moments in the paper involves his discussion of the specific gun that George Zimmerman had purchased and used to kill Trayvon Martin, and the innovation by which it was defined, right? Like the idea that this was a lightweight, portable version of a 9mm, and this is precisely what enables it to be wielded with such deadly force. Brandon's emphasis on the importance of addressing infrastructure in this way here, specifically objects and tools, is used to show us how our relationships with these objects is racialized. But I think the heart of the project also lies in a sophisticated analysis of, as Kessie calls it, the uneven geographies that shape relations between guns and users, but also the history of access to guns that sort of brand in flags, but I think there's a lot more there that could be mined and sort of made more explicit in his argument. I was sort of reminded of research I had done on the history of policing, where it's sort of clear that in the late 18th century, in New Orleans, but also elsewhere in the South Atlantic, slave owners, planters were petitioning the state legislators for the right to carry arms, because until that point, only the military or like night watchmen in certain cities had access to arms. And so they petitioned for the right to be able to carry arms, which is why it becomes such an important issue with the Second Amendment. And they would also, as they went out on these, they used their arms on these slave patrols, they would dress the same way so they could recognize each other on slave patrols. And in this way, there was sort of this vernacular tradition of policing that emerged decades before formal policing in like police precincts. So like if you look at like books on the history of policing, they always say policing started in Boston in the 1840s. But if you look at this southern tradition of sort of slave patrols, it's a way of kind of surveilling and policing societies in particular for fugitive slaves, but not exclusively. And so I think that emphasis on the histories of the way that people successfully petition for the right to use arms and for the right to be able to wield lethal force would only strengthen the argument he develops. I have to say overall, I was really pleased to be part of this panel, in part because the title of the panel is Elements, and Element is like one of my favorite songs on Kendrick Lamar's new album, Damn. But there's this moment in Kevin's paper that reminded me of a line from this Nas song, No Ideas Original, where he says, Nas says, courtrooms, eagles and flags, American style, while in our world the ghetto stays incredibly foul. Watching for paint chips, don't want no lead in your child, but them gangsters put lead in your child. And so Nas plays with this idea of lead paint as this toxin and lead as something that will kill you. So it's just some of the themes you develop in your paper. Kevin's paper is about tragedy of lead poisoning and mental illness. And his concern explicitly is with the sort of deracinated analysis that allows the state to escape culpability through lead poisoning as a kind of silent killer. And he suggests that lead and exposure to lead is paradigmatic of broader struggles that provoke debate about how we might, as Kevin puts it, how do we make legible and legitimate black demands and needs? So how do we not allow the state to escape and instead make legible and legitimate the concerns oppressed people have? And he also has this really nice moment in the paper where he sort of talks about lead, the threat of lead in American toys from China, and says how it provokes futurist anxieties about whiteness and nationhood, but then lead in black children creates an alibi for uneven geographies that define black thingification to legitimize and quarantine our ability to respond to state violence. So I thought he very successfully sort of shows us how we might re-theorize this predicament around lead. Chloe draws upon a performative protest by a woman from Soweto who defecated in public because she wanted people to know she didn't have a toilet, and that she was going to use the world as her toilet. And she was later in a different sort of performance protest, was laying on the ground, corpse-like. And these provocative images provide a brilliant way to frame the idea of colonization as thingification that Aimé Césaire argued and also Kevin mentioned in his paper. Chloe builds on this insight as a way to return us to themes that Kessie highlighted at the outset about the uneven geographies that define life for colonized people and the role that infrastructure plays in shaping social possibilities. I thought Chloe's paper, more than any other, highlighted the affective structure of an uneven geography, the shame, the pornotroping, the way that religious meaning can be derived from the most pronounced failures of secular governance, as when Biko is chained in a jail cell in a crucified position and left to die, a perverted use of infrastructure if ever there was one, or in Leseho Rampo Looking's Gun Day Prayer, you mentioned. And Chloe insists that survival brings forth naked truths. And she also shows us how these forensic reports, related to that point, she shows how these forensic reports and other forms of surveillance are used to sort of monitor and corral people in South African townships. And as Chloe reminds us, survival makes us vulnerable. And so I want to sort of use that point to sort of bring together some strands in the paper. This idea that survival makes us vulnerable, and there's some things lurking in the papers that I sort of want to tease out and throw out to the audience. And they kind of tie together around what Kevin called the singularity of slavery. And he sort of also foregrounded Anthony Frawley's claim that slaves and masters have nothing in common. And I guess my main question would be, in what sense does the geography that's being charted in these papers, the fate of black and brown people, in what sense is it distinct and unique relative to other people's? And like, if it's distinct and unique, what accounts for this uniqueness, but also how far does this uniqueness go? Like what Kessie calls a black geographic theory, right? What is sort of the state of black subjectivity in this theory, right? There are many theories you could say have been marshaled to explain the predicament of black people in particular, right? Like social death, racial capitalism, increasingly white supremacy is being used analytically in papers. But what I want to know is the argument that like racial capitalism or social death defines a historical predicament, or is it like an existential plight, right? Like, do black people suffer under an existential plight that's different from any other people's, or are we grappling with a unique historical predicament, or could it be both? If it's the former, the question then is, okay, a historical predicament can be addressed through social problems, right, and policy solutions, but an existential plight, it seems, cannot be addressed in the same way, right? An existential plight, like if indeed blackness presents a different mode of subjectivity, how do you grapple with that? You know, it's sort of like, I guess, the argument about double consciousness is another version of this. Is double consciousness something people struggle with in particular conditions, or is it just the way that black people understand the world? You know, because if in fact slavery has left this indelible mark on black people, and if black people will forever be changed by slavery, could someone then make the argument that black people will never be able to respect law and order in the same way? Black people will never be able to learn the same way as a result of slavery, if in fact it is an existential predicament, right? So how far does the argument about what it is go? You know, do you want to suggest that it's a social historical predicament, or that it's more than that? If it's more than that, how do we manage that? Because there's a weird way that argument can dovetail with certain very conservative positions, right? That like black children aren't capable of learning the same way, even if it is in fact because of slavery. So that the only solution then would be special ed courses in school, incarceration, or extermination, if in fact black people can never be like other people. So I sort of just want to end it there, throw that out to see precisely how you think through this question of black death and suffering, precisely whether a sort of black theory, a black geographic theory is what we're after, and if that's what we're after, how do we understand the contours of that framework? Thank you.
I have a question, but I don't want to derail.
No, feel free. No, yeah, then I'll get to respond to my question.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay, I have a question for Brandon. I really liked your presentation. Well, I had like sort of question and comment. The first comment is that what I thought about as you were presenting is sort of under what circumstances guns become conspicuous, and under what circumstances guns are sort of inconspicuous. And I was thinking about contemporary sort of debates about gun control that sort of completely leave out police officers, as if police officers with guns is sort of like that's natural and sort of a part of a natural order. So I really like this idea of a gun as a technology of white supremacy. Yeah, I just wanted to say that. And then the question was about, you mentioned this sort of Marissa Alexandre case, and I was wondering what you, so recently before the state legislature sort of drafted another bill that would redouble the stipulated immunities of stand your ground, and I think Marissa Alexandre actually is the sort of poster child of that, as you noted before. She was not the poster child before. So I wonder how that affects what you're discussing here in terms of like her sort of usage, or her using her as a sort of icon or a symbol of why gun law should be expanded or made more inclusive, but also sort of expanded to facilitate this sort of white supremacist practice.
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like in some ways the stand your ground laws were originally supposed to be race neutral, and then it obviously turned out that in practice they were not. They were never really going to be, and I think that's Alexandre's story. And so the push to protect someone like her, I guess I'm a little pessimistic that things will come out that way in practice, that juries, judges, that there's so much also when I'm in the paper I'm trying to talk about this really part of the pun loaded history in the gun that is inescapable, that there's too much of the possession of a gun around black or brown individuals that biases too much, I think, the ability, like, already plays a role in shaping that context. At the same time, the paper is also operating with the idea about race as an unfolding. And so maybe this is a switch, like maybe this is a new possibility or creates a new context in which gun ownership, so I think here about Lando Castile, who said, I have a permit, right? I have a gun, and he was still shot. Maybe there's an opening discursively for black and brown gun ownership to be accepted, and maybe this is where that's going. I'm pessimistic. I'm like very suspicious of that possibility. But I think that's there.
I would just add, Kevin, I would add to Michael's provocation about this sort of, whether it's historical and whether, these conditions of blackness are historically situated and or this sort of ontological. And I'm adding to that the kind of embodiment of the toxicity in a way that naturalizes, I think this is kind of what you're talking about, like the sort of the relationship of black people to lead and rethinking intimacy and toxicity in that way. But I'm also wondering if you could comment on the idea of kind of like the ontology part, but also when things become naturalized or are understood as natural, that and particularly embodied, so that makes it kind of difficult to disentangle what was conceived as natural and also what's conceived as artificial.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks. I think maybe first, like to maybe like get towards your question. What does it mean? How does the singularity of slavery change the game, right? Is it something that like affects just black people or like all people? And last night, as I was like making last minute edits to this paper, I was like re-engaging with like why I approached Césaire's quote, where he says that colonization is the process of thingification, but it's not just thingification for like the colonized person who becomes an instrument of production, right? Through the rupture of slavery, everyone is changed and altered, and such that they kind of lose a certain kind of human subjectivity or capacity to relate with each other, because like modernity is like kind of like structured by these logics that like are anti-black at its core, but it also challenges us to think more deeply about like how everyone else is affected, and not like is this a thing like singular to black people, and like if that's even like where like the question should go or whatever, rather like how does like slavery as like the constitutive element of modernity like shape all realms of possibility for like all people, right? And like how does that like complicate how we think about those things?
Yeah, if I could just jump in there, because I like the formulation, and actually I had a part in my discussion where I was going to talk about like Hegel, because I feel like that's something Farley's taking up as well, slave master, and I was thinking about sort of this idea of the sort of fact that the slave master can never be free as long as there's slavery, nor can the slave be free, and that freedom is from this sort of like tension that transforms into a new society, a new species of person. And so I like when you put it, and I guess why I asked the question was not because I think we should think of it as either singular or not, but I guess what I meant was that in the literature, you find both interpretations. Like when people were suggesting something like nothing compares to slavery, and nothing, as a result, black people suffered unlike any other kind of people, and as a result, black people are different from any other people. Like it's sort of, it's kind of a chain of arguments that leads you someplace where like then you have this argument of sort of singularity that's actually not historical or something like that. Whereas what you're talking about is more of a kind of predicament people are wrestling with.
Yeah. Yes. And so part two, like to get maybe back to your question about like maybe like what are the risks of this kind of embodiment or whatever that like I'm teasing out. I mean, I don't like necessarily have an easy answer to that. You know, I don't think it's like a either or, like one thing is possible or the other thing is possible. I think what I tried to like think about in the paper was, you know, just as this kind of like embodiment and relationality with toxicity and lead or like Corin made it possible her to think differently about a couple of things or whatever, like simultaneously, like these same like assumed proximities, both like assumed and material proximities to like lead allow like the state and media actors to like, you know, discredit and delegitimize her, you know. So it's these things that are like happening at the same time that like I don't necessarily know like how one like can escape one or the other, like outside of like your own political investments for like how you decide to like read the work, you know, which I think is like important and why I came back to like an ethics of representation at the end or whatever. So yeah, I don't know. That's like as far as that's
Just real quick, also on the discussion of lead, I met a guy who works in public health. He's like a emeritus professor of public health, and he worked a lot in prisons and things like that. And he's really concerned about like the epidemic of lead poisoning, particularly in New York. But what was fascinating and disturbing to me was that he had sort of come to the conclusion that the reason why there was such high rates of violence among African Americans had to do with lead poisoning, and he wanted to attack it as a kind of, you know, from environmental racism, but he also took it as a matter of fact, right? Like he accepted it as a fact that black people were violent, but said it's because of lead poisoning. And I was so troubled by this argument, especially from a health official, right, or a public health expert. So what I like about your paper too is that you're sort of complicating the naturalizing of this relationship, but it is this kind of fascinating, disturbing how it's happening, right? That like, okay, well, it's obvious this person was around high rates of lead. It's obvious this person's physiologically different than other people, and therefore, how do we deal with it? Or something like that.
Something that I mean, this is part of like a larger thing. Something that like I didn't include was kind of an engagement with Jonathan Metzl's book called The Protest Psychosis, which shows the way how prior to like the 1960s and 70s, schizophrenia was like a disease that affected like docile like housewives in like white suburban places or whatever, and how like through the confluence of social and medical discourses that like were happening in like this like moment, as well as like the heightened racial anxieties of the moment or whatever, schizophrenia was like refigured as like a black disease or whatever, as a protest psychosis, as delusional anti-whiteness. And so I'm like really interested in like how, regardless of what might be empirical or biological facts about proximity to toxin and lead or whatever, I'm really interested at like at least I lost my train of thought.
In addition to like the science of toxicity, you're interested in.
What was I
Like,
talking about? Like before.
well, I think you're trying to say that like
the
you're saying,
separation between it and
I think you're saying that like in addition to the scientific discourse, you want to know about like the assumptions people are making
and so
politically.
like I'm really also cognizant in my paper or whatever about like the current moment that we're in, like how lead poisoning and like lead is being deployed in like similar ways,
Right.
You know, like that like it's kind of like devoid of like sympathy or some kind of like moral urgency to like do something about it or whatever, and it's more actually just like, well, these blacks are crazy already.
Right.
You know? So
no, exactly. The thing that happens too in the prisons is they say like, well, these guys are different than prisoners of 20 years ago because these guys are in jail for violent crimes. 20 years ago they were just drug crimes, but they're not thinking about how the effort to depict people as violent is part of it. Like, is this person objectively more violent, or it's just that they're always now charged with more violent crimes? Like, they now like menacing, in New York, menacing is a crime. Just looking at a police officer in that supposedly hostile way, right? So the crimes have been made more violent, and then the assumption is the people are more violent. So I think the thing you're doing that is important.
Because then that kind of reinscribes the symbolic structure in which she's working.
Right.
Well, that's, I think, a little bit too. I thought that our papers in some ways were dialoguing with each other. And
Yeah, they
all of
are.
ours,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
especially yours and mine, at least thinking about this concept of lead and what it's doing. in shaping a certain kind of either subjectivity or perception of subjectivity is like pointing to the gun and saying that's doing almost the same thing for whites. That whites are somehow sort of animated by the gun or by the power of the gun. And there's a kind of mimetic quality, I think, on the other side, which is to say, like, all cops are angry, or all cops are racist, or and I think locating that in either the uniform they wear, the military equipment they have, the exposure that they have to certain, like, routinized forms of violence is sort of working the same way. But I don't think it's, I think I would think that it's the political possibilities are the second step, which I think are always where the risk runs, right? So I think I feel like in the context of prisons, that the idea is like, we're going to get the lead out, and we're going to redesign these prisons and make them more humane and better. But that's never how the discourse goes, right? Because that's one political possibility.
Well, so that's what makes it unique, right? Like, that's not necessary. So to sort of bring back the sort of materiality of it. So for number one, the idea is that lead exposure is irreversible.
Right.
And that it's a combination, it's cumulative from childhood, right? So that you're most vulnerable to it as a child, and over the course of your childhood, you accumulate it in your body, and then this aggression is irreversible.
Right.
So that kind of characterization of lead poisoning is crucial. So the next step would not be to remove lead out of the prisons. The damage has been done. Is the narrative.
Yeah. So all that's left is to quarantine that population, essentially put them in prison, or they can do manual labor, or whatever else that, as long as there's sequestered from the rest of it.
Right.
Yeah. No,
but then the engineering question already becomes prefigured by the political, because for all we know, we can remove lead out of the body.
Right.
Like the possibilities of science get precluded by racial politics.
Right. Like what I like about the way you broke it down is that there's this argument with several elements stacked on top of each other, and we don't know that any of those things is true. Like, we don't know that every child in the environment is affected that way. We certainly don't know that it's cumulative in that way. We definitely don't know that it's irreversible, but people make all three claims, and then after that, at least other thing, So, yeah.
But then also, I guess the question that you posed in relation to this idea of accumulation, the distinction between are we in a historical moment or are we dealing with an existential plight, then becomes also further complicated.
Yeah.
If you're talking about Hegel and this question of like history and this political moment, and what is the political time of the black body and what is our moral response to this?
Right.
Well, see, the question of the existential and the historical also are kind of collapsing.
They are, but I think that, like, I would say intellectually and politically, it seems to me like it is important to hold on to the idea of the black subject as a historical subject, right? Because then there's some obvious possibilities, right? Like, if in fact, you've been denied access to education, you can be granted access to education. If you're denied healthcare, you can be granted healthcare. If in fact that your whole constitution is shaped by centuries of trauma, and even access to education can't help that, then why bother to give you education? You see what I'm saying? So I think that the argument that there's something about the constitution of black subject that's fundamentally different can be really dangerous in the wrong hands. So even if there's something unique, right? Like, we can all claim a sort of unique relationship to history, but I think the idea, because I don't necessarily want to indict specific scholars per se, but like, this I do want to do. Okay, I'll give you an example. So I've taught at Barnard before, and in classes at Barnard, I've received the argument that like black people don't have a place in history, unlike any other people. Like, black people don't know their place in history, and that like for anyone else, they can know exactly where their family came from and trace their entire family history back. It's a black people. So empirically, that's not true, actually, right? Like, there are many people who, because of war, displacement, all kinds of things, have lost their family history, and also now there are kinds of technologies that allow black people to reconstruct history, whether it's DNA testing or something like that. So different ways you can play with that idea. But I think the idea that you are a people without history is one version of the singularity, that you are sort of people uniquely without history or something like that, or that there are many versions of that argument, the singularity argument. And I think like singularity is different than historical uniqueness in the sense that history is unique for any given group of people, right? But it's a little different to say. There's a version of this that's even more popular, like black is the color of the cosmos, kind of like black people, like, black people have, I don't know, a unique spiritual faculty, organic relationship to the elements, this kind of version of it, right? Which, that can actually be cool and empowering and intriguing, but it could also be a version of the kind of singular. You see what I'm saying? Because one version of it would be like the assumption that black people are faster than other people, more athletic, or something else. You know, there's all kinds of ways it can spin out into discourses that most of us not subscribe to. You know, oh, sorry. I guess one more example I could give is like
She had a question.
Oh yeah. Sorry.
That's it.
Well, I was gonna say like I'm searching for like an example that I think is like both really relevant to our conversation and also troubling. You know, because for me the stakes of it are really high. So I guess one version of it could be like some people would say, well, if you find an example of like a woman who was enslaved and then was purchased by a slave owner, had children with that person, and when he dies, he's a white man, he leaves his inheritance, his property to her and the children, and they grow up as free people of color with land and education. Some people might say, okay, that's an interesting example of a black person with social mobility. Some people might say, well, if you're black, no matter how rich you are, you'll never be free, or something like that, right? In the sense that, and so that could be a social, comes in a social historical predicament, like, well, or it could be something like black as a kind of stigma almost. You know what I mean? And they're different, so I think the stigma part is the part that could be potentially troubling.
Well, I'm still thinking about the lead, but maybe it goes back to what you're saying. I'm curious, Kessie, how the people who you work with confront, how can they protest against contamination if, like, admitting that contamination has these negative effects, right? Because to say we are experiencing these negative effects, so therefore we shouldn't have to live this way, but then they're getting hit with, well, there's something wrong with you if you have blood poisoning. And I'm brought to think about Martha Stakowski's work on nuclear issues in Kazakhstan, where people, they're being told that they should have genetic passports and they shouldn't reproduce if they have nuclear poisoning of some kind. And so actually now a lot of people who are experiencing the negative effects of nuclear radiation are kind of denying it. And so it leaves so little room to protest and make certain demands. And I'm curious if any of the people who you work with are confronting that.
Yeah. So, I brought up children partly because sort of the major site of concerns about water contamination with lead is schools. So that school fountains are actually the source of childhood exposure to lead through water. I mean, there are other ways in which they might be exposed to lead, but those have kind of become the sites in which a lot of attention about lead contamination has come from, and not necessarily through houses just yet, because it had been found that a number of schools, not only in Newark, but around New Jersey, because the systems within the schools are old, and there's a story, I think janitors are instructed to flush the system once they come in. So it's people working within these schools are well aware that their water systems are older and that they might be exposing children to contaminants through the water. But now it's sort of more light has come to that. And so from the field, I'm aware of a group of high school students who are trying to mobilize around these issues of lead, but actually the lead issues versus the flooding issues, which seem more salient in a way, more ubiquitous in a way, they're not necessarily taking the same kind of, or attracting the same kind of attention. In fact, one person told me, who works with the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, that there's quite a bit of mobilizing around the Flint water crisis when word came to Newark about it, or actually the whole country about it in 2014. But the issues in Newark itself, so the issues within the schools, actually haven't received the same kind of spotlight and the same kind of mobilization around it. I think partly because it has not become this issue that is in spaces outside of schools just yet. in terms of so we go back to knowledge production, right? In terms of the knowledge or the data that's been produced about where the lead is, it's been at the schools. And so children and their exposure to lead have kind of been the site. So they are not, the idea is not that they have already been poisoned, but that they are currently being poisoned or they're at risk of being poisoned, and that needs to be sort of mitigated. The attention is not necessarily on lead exposure of adults in that way.
That's interesting. I mean, I think I like what you're bringing in as far as like this idea of knowledge, because it also reminded me, connected to this singularity thing about the discourse, right? Studies have shown that doctors think black people can handle more pain than white patients, right? And I guess, like, you can make the argument that, like, okay, slavery made African Americans tougher, but the flip side of the argument is the idea that black people can handle more pain. And I guess that's a good example of where the singularity can be really dangerous. This idea that somehow it's a different species you're dealing with or something like that, right? So, it's kind of fascinating, I think.
So I'm trying to think about that while also to get back to your question to me about Black geographic knowledge,
right,
and if that is a sort of expertise. So I'm thinking about that form of knowledge and that way of knowing in relation to the ways in which Black people have also been depicted as being detached from an environment, or so in addition to being without history, being without place. And so, Carolyn Finney, she wrote a book called Black Faces, White Spaces, and sort of talking about environmentalism and outdoors, sort of playing in the outdoors. So the idea of playing or leisure in the outdoors, so the American discourse on the outdoors often excludes Black people, or the discourse on environmental stewardship often excludes. So thinking about that in tension with also making Black people as part of nature, or closer to nature than man in the winter kind of sense. So yeah, I'm thinking about that tension too, right? Also being without place, but then also in tension with being closer to nature without that nature. It's an interesting sort of site that I'm trying to think about.
Oh, sorry, we're out of time. Thank you for a great discussion, great pictures. I really enjoyed reading